Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's event. Buenos dias. My name is Beatriz Garcia-Nice, Associate with the Latin American Program here at the Wilson Center. Thank you for joining us here today in person and also virtually. We're here today to discuss the ongoing political crisis that Peru faces. Last December, then President Pedro Castillo attempted to illegally dissolve Congress and was later impeached and arrested. His then Vice President, Dina Boluarte, took office hours later, ensuring a democratic transition of power. Peru has had 6 presidents in 7 years, a result of years of public corruption and a chronically dysfunctional relationship between Congress and the presidency. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. To understand and most importantly, contribute to solutions, we must understand that Peru's ongoing crisis has multiple layers. A first layer is Peru's legacy of authoritarianism and exclusion, with rural and indigenous peoples being historically underserved. The election of the country's first campesino president raised hopes for change among his rural supporters. However, from the moment he took office, Castillo became highly ineffective. He also faced an obstructionist opposition and became unable to govern. He avoided 2 impeachment attempts, and a 3rd attempt was in the making until his arrest. A second layer is Peru's recent economic struggles. 70% of Peruvians work in the informal sector. Additionally, Peru is the country with the highest rate of food insecurity in Latin America. A third layer is President Boluarte's inability to gather support from the public, especially from Castillo supporters. With demonstrations ravaging rural areas of the country and reaching city centers, including Lima, her capacity to govern has become more limited. Demonstrations turned violent and were met with excessive force, leaving over 50 dead and thousands injured. The heavy-handed government response has increased public anger against Boluarte, who legally should finish Castillo's term ending in 2026. To the majority of Peruvians, that is unacceptable. Recent polls show that over 70% of Peruvians disapprove of Boluarte, and nearly 90% hold a negative view of Congress. Peruvians are demanding new elections as soon as possible, a new Congress, and a new constitution. To discuss alternatives to solve Peru's crisis and share some of the latest developments from Lima, we are joined virtually by former President of Peru, Francisco Sagasti, who's currently a Lowell Fellow here at the Wilson Center, but is currently in Lima. And here in person, our former President of Colombia and Distinguished Fellow here at the Center, Iván Duque, and our moderator, Juan José Neira, advisor of the CAF presidency. Juan José, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Beatriz. It's for me a great honor to moderate this panel with 2 former presidents, President Duque, an old friend of Peru, and a paladin of democracy in the region, and former President Sagasti, who was the only president in Peru who completed the term who was supposed to serve in the last 5 years. He did a magnificent job in Peru, especially getting vaccines in the middle of a terrible crisis of the pandemic in Peru. I want to welcome them and to share this discussion about Peru. Let's start with President Duque. President Duque, you face a lot of protests and during your term in Colombia, and you have some experience dealing democratically with these claims of the people on the streets. In Peru, it seems that we are in a stalemate where no progress can be made apparently in any direction. Can you share your views on these, and what are your recommendations for Peru societies at this time?
So thank you so much, Dr. Neira, for your introduction. And also, I want to express my deepest friendship and admiration to my good friend, President Sagasti. President Sagasti, it's an honor to be here with you today. I also want to thank the Woodrow Wilson Center for organizing this event. And I think your question is quite deep, Juan Jose. And maybe my reflections are the following. First thing to consider is that Peru has become the country in South America with the most complicated political instability. This is not new. This is not Dina's situation. This has happened in the last 6 years, starting from Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, then President Vizcarra, then you had Merino, and you had Meche Arauz in the middle of that situation, then President Sagasti, who had to put all the pieces together and guarantee a transition, then President Castillo, and now Dina Boluarte. So it's a lot of instability. Now, that instability for quite some time was seen with a dash of salt or sugar, as you might wish, because Peru had a lot of economic instability. It was kind of weird managing such an amount of political instability with such a great level of economic stability in terms of the currency, in terms of the fiscal deficit. In many of the indicators, Peru was one of the top performers in Latin America. But today, the political instability is now rapidly translating into economic instability. And we're seeing a lot of resources coming out of the country. We're seeing a lot of corporations trying to hedge the risks in the country, paying enormous amounts of money for that compensation of the risk they're taking. And we're seeing also that translating into the way the macroeconomic performance is measured by international organizations. So that for me is a major worry. Now, saying that, the current situation was triggered because President Castillo tried to derail the constitutional system of Peru. He was literally moving into a coup d'etat. He wanted even to capture members of the Attorney General's office. And he was calling to put an absolute blockade to the work of independent powers. So the solution that Peru has seen is a constitutional response to such an attempt to destroy the Constitution. And Dina Boluarte is trying to guarantee stability in a moment where she has not only to face the pressure of radicals inside the country, but also the pressure of radicals out of the country who are trying to unlegitimize the constitutional transition that Peru has to guarantee the stability of the country. So by describing all this, I think there are three dimensions to be attended. One dimension is the security dimension, and if there have been wrongdoings or abuses by members of the police and military bodies, they have to be not only investigated, but they have to be rapidly trialed. She has to build a minimum consensus to be able to stabilize Peru. And that's something that I think my good friend, President Paco Sagasti, will get into the weeds, but there has to be an agreement of all the political establishment of Peru to guarantee the economic stability and the transition out. And obviously, the Constitution does not allow to call for a new election at this moment, or at least it's not simple. It's nothing that can happen overnight. They have to build the institutional mechanism if that's the way the country wants to move. But for now, Dina is in power, and she has to guarantee the transition. And I believe the most important thing that has to be ensured is a level of governance consensus, at least to stabilize the country and define the next step in terms of the political transition. While on the security front, it is clear that there have been also interference from the outside to exacerbate sentiments in Peru. It has happened in Ecuador, it happened in Colombia, it happened in Chile, and now it's also happening in Peru. And just to put a little bit more of controversy to the conversation, I just don't get when I see leaders in Latin America that are now so tough on Dina, but so tough on so soft on Ortega, or so soft on Maduro, or many others. Because what has been happening in Peru is a constitutional transition. So with that, I leave the rest of the comments to my good friend President Sagasti.
President Sagasti, do you have something to add, or do you have a different views?
First of all, thanks very much for the invitation. Thanks to the Wilson Center. Thanks to my dear friend, Iván Duque, with whom we have had some discussions while I was in the presidency, although all of them virtual, as this one is. And I appreciate the interest that the region is placing and is putting in the situation in Peru. I have always said, or many years ago, that Peru is almost like a social and political laboratory. Things happen here sooner in a much more clear fashion that then begin to happen elsewhere in the region. So the instability that President Duque refers to is not new for us. We know exactly what has been happening in other parts of the region during the last several years. And President Duque himself, as he pointed out, had to confront a very, very difficult situation with several uprisings, some difficulties, and as he pointed out, as will happen in the case of Peru, I am sure it has happened in the case of Colombia, when there are excesses in part of the police and the armed forces that they should be tried speedily and so on. And I think the experience of Colombia during President Duque and his predecessors in dealing with this type of unrest can be most helpful to us and also most helpful to the region. Having said that, and turning to the problem, I think I would like to emphasize something that President Duque pointed out, and I think it's extremely important. Yes, Peru is an unstable country from the political perspective. We have had 6 presidents in 6 years and so on, but all the transitions have been made according to the constitutional rules, according to the norms. We have had no unconstitutional interruption during the more than 20 years that we have had a new constitution and a series of transition governments. So at least we are keeping that, and in spite of really extreme forces from the left and from the right, in both extremes of the political spectrum in Peru, who would really like to see some kind of either coup or takeover and so on, we still have managed to maintain our institutional arrangements within the framework of the Constitution. The second thing which is important is something, again, that President Duque very wisely pointed out. During the period of unrest, which really began to start around 2016, when we had the first of a few situations which are very detrimental to democracy. And by the way, not only in Peru, but in Latin America, in the United States, and in the region. And I refer to the situation in which, after you have agreed to the rules of electoral processes, and you appear to be losing, even if it is for a very small amount, you begin to question the rules and to begin to argue that there has going to be fraud. In other words, the idea is, if I lose, then there must be fraud. This goes against a fundamental tenure of democratic institutions, which is the consent of the loser. And unfortunately, we're beginning to see that disappearing in other places in the region and even in the United States as well. So the key problem is that during the last 5 to 6 years, there has been, in the whole of the region, by the way, there has begun a process of eroding the democratic habits and norms that used to be taken for granted in previous years. In the case of Peru, we had about 15 years of relative calm, in terms of politics and so on, of growth. We took, we were benefited by the boom in the prices of primary commodities, and Peru exhibited for about 15 years probably the highest rate of economic growth during the 2000 to 2015-16. Several of us argued very strongly at that time that this was a unique period we had not seen in Peru, at least since the one of bonanza more than 100 years ago, and that we should take advantage of that situation to enact a series of institutional, social, and economic reforms that would benefit the majority. Unfortunately, what happened during those 15 years of bonanza was that instead of focusing on the reforms that were absolutely required and necessary, we saw widespread corruption to the point that all the presidents from that period, in one way or the other, are under indictment, under investigation, awaiting extradition, or in prison. So we wasted those years of growth. Now the question is, how can we look back and begin to recover the lost time, en búsqueda del tiempo perdido, a recherche du temps perdu, in a sense. That is the task we have in front of us. Now, coming to the present situation, it is quite clear that after clean, free, and transparent elections during 2021, the year of the bicentenary of independence, former President Pedro Castillo won by a very, very small margin. By the way, quite similar to the margin that Pedro Pablo Kuczynski had 5 years earlier, and also very similar to the margin by which the current mayor of Lima won against its opponent. But lo and behold, while in the 2021 elections, which were certified to be absolutely clear, free, and without any trace of fraud, certified by the international community of electoral observers, there was one group from the extreme right that questioned absolutely the results and began, after saying that they would accept the results, began to question them. By the way, these right-wing groups that questioned the 2021 election, the general election for president and Congress, saying that there was fraud when the winner, Mr. Castillo, won for about 40,000 votes, when the mayor of Lima from the extreme right won by the same amount, the elections were absolutely free. So we are seeing a situation in which some groups, and I won't give some other examples from the left as well, but the two extremes are trying to subvert electoral process and democratic procedures. And this is something we really must be quite clear about and fight against. What are the possible way out of the current stalemate? And I think it can be called a statement. As we know, Congress has a very low approval rate, below 10%, and has been like this for quite some time. The President of the Republic has about 20% approval rate in the population, about, as is one mentioned by Beatriz Garcia Nice, we have seen, and we have about 70% of the population, according to public opinion polls, who would like both Congress and the executive to leave. So the way out is to bring forward the elections, and this has become a general agreement. And by the way, I proposed that several months ago, and we pointed out at that time some ways of doing that with minimum political disruption. So the question is, how can we make that happen? And unfortunately, apparently Congress, and to a lesser extent the executive, are not really willing to take the steps necessary to bring forward elections, and at least to provide an initial step to begin solving the political crisis and putting Peru back in a path towards peace, growth, and democratic consolidation. Thanks very much, Mr. Neira.
Thank you, Mr. Sagasti. Yes, how can we avoid that after the next election, Peru will be not in the same situation. Because a deeper problem is in Peru, I think, is that Peru needs a political reform, to make the political parties more open and represent the demands of the population. So what kind of reforms Peru can make in this short period of time to ensure that Peru will be not in the same situation after the next election? President Duque.
So I always try to be very respectful in the way I make judgments on other countries, because obviously the Peruvians are the ones who have the right expertise. But I think the Peruvian constitution is based on an assumption, and it is that the presidency always has a vast majority in Congress. So when you basically analyze the Peruvian constitution, the only way that stability can be guaranteed is with a very strong majority and a very strong consensus. When you saw the fall of Fujimori and then the transition of Valentin Paniagua and then the rise of Toledo and then Garcia and then Humala and then so on, basically those 15 years after the fall of Fujimori, with the Fujimorian constitution, had a great amount of stability, politically and economically. And there were a lot of changes, positive changes that took place in Peru. The possibility of expanding the social safety nets, the increase in life expectancy, the coverage of education, health, housing, water, was marvelous, with a very strong stability of terms of economic growth, where on average it was above 5%. That's something that few countries in Latin America have seen. But what happened after the election of PPK, of Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, was a weakening also in the capacity to build strong majorities. And when Kuczynski fell, none of the presidents since then, and obviously President Sagasti is a different case, because President Sagasti was elected by the Congress to protect the stability of the republic and guarantee the calling of a new election. But all the elected presidents since then have not been able to build a strong coalition nor a strong majority, and that's where they fall in the Peruvian constitutional trap, which is, you don't have majority, then you'll get Congress not to approve your cabinet appointments or not to approve your government plans. And if you're rejected twice, then the president has the possibility to call for a congressional election. And if that is the case, then Congress asks for a presidential election. And that simply puts the country into a permanent stalemate. And that is absolutely insane for the sake of Peru. So what I believe has to occur right now is to guarantee the democratic stability. And I think President Sagasti well pointed out that all the presidents since the fall of Kuczynski have been elected or selected by constitutional means, not with the destruction of the constitutional architecture. But at this point, either two things happen: or there's a strong consensus and a great majority is built among all the political parties to guarantee that Dina finishes Castillo's term, or there has to be an anticipation of elections. But then your question is also very important. Will Peru fall in the same circumstances? Assuming that it's a atomization of political parties and political movements, it's going to be very difficult to guarantee a strong consensus and a strong majority. So maybe what I'll say might sound very theoretical as a solution, but it's the only way that countries that face this type of circumstances in Latin America have been able to do it. An agreement like Punto Fijo or an agreement like the one Colombia made after the dictatorship of Rojas Pinilla, in which the parties all get together at a minimum amount of consensus to guarantee the continuity and the peaceful transition of power and the economic stability that goes hand in hand. If that's not guaranteed, the same old story will happen, because now the cost of guaranteeing the cohesion in Congress is very high for the administrations. And if we don't put things that way, with that bluntness, we will fall again into the naiveness thinking that it's just election what is going to guarantee the transition. That's not going to happen. And if the polarization remains between extreme right and extreme left, it's going to be painful for Peru. So I think figures like President Sagasti, who's a very not only a recognized statesman, but someone who has situated always himself in the political spectrum as a centrist and has been able to bridge divides, figures like him can help bridge the right political consensus that is needed today. Either to call for new elections, that majority is required, even to move on in the way that the prosecutions need to happen with President Castillo, but also if there were wrongdoings by members of the military, they require a strong amount of political consensus. And I think that's the challenge that Peru faces today.
Thank you, President Duque. President Sagasti, please, your comments.
Thank you very much. I think it's quite important to listen to the experience of other statesmen in the region. And I think there are two aspects that I can refer to in this intervention. The first one is the one you raised, Dr. Neira, about whether another election will repeat the same situation that we have now. Well, one of the things that was proposed in a couple of articles and then taken up by many other people, and I'm talking about something that happened in March, April of last year, and then has continued to go through and beginning to gather more and more adepts, is the following. Bring forward the elections with a minimum of changes that could be agreed quickly, but would guarantee a better representation in Congress. For example, a prohibition to stand as a candidate for those who have been convicted of corruption, of crimes, or anything like that, and then a much more selective process, the question of having internal primaries in all the political parties, the alternation between men and women in lists of candidates. In other words, a minimum set of changes that would ensure a better representation whenever an ex-president and an ex-Congress is elected within the next year or two, in the case that elections are brought forward. At the same time, being very mindful of all the fundamental changes that are required in the Constitution, not really to create a new Constitution from scratch, but there are many things that can be improved. For example, President Duque referred to the relations between the executive and the legislative Congress. And what happens is we have quite an ambiguous situation in the Constitution of 1993, which has lent itself really to some of the abuses that we have seen in terms of arbitrary interpretation of causes for impeachment and so on and so forth. Some of them have been justified, others not so much, and so on. So there is a need for improvements. So our argument was very simple. Let's charge this new Congress, who will complete the term until 2026, with an agenda of very specific constitutional changes, not to create a new constitution from scratch, which is an illusion, because people believe that as soon as you have a new constitution, everything will change. We know it's not the case. But what we can do is to task a Congress that is elected to complete the term until 2026 with a few specific changes. For example, to establish a Senate, to clarify the rules of impeachment and the relation between Congress and the executive, to really guarantee the independence of certain institutions, and so on and so forth. There are a few changes that can be introduced without having to have a new constitution, and this is feasible to do in the short term. And by the way, during the last 15 years, we have modified the Constitution at least in 12 times, so it's not a sacred document in any way. The second issue has to do with what President Duque called as the conditions for political stability. And here I beg to differ with him. My dear friend, I think that you are putting as the only condition for political stability that the president should have a majority in Congress. I think that that's not the case. As a matter of fact, I had no support in Congress, although mine was a limited period, but I was able to build coalitions with different groups, even with those that opposed me in a violent way. So there is the possibility that when you have a good president of Congress and a good president of the Republic, a good president of the judiciary, and other powers of the state, you can come together even though you do not have an absolute majority in Congress. I think that probably the best solution is that the government in power, I mean in the executive, should have a plurality. Certainly not a very small percentage, but not so large, not a majority, which then brings immediately, as we have seen all over Latin America, the temptation of authoritarian rule. The moment that you have no checks and balances for the executive from Congress, you really enter into a situation that unfortunately we have seen, and he mentioned other cases in Colombia, we have seen this in Chile, we have seen this in Argentina, in Brazil, and so on and so forth. So I think that this very strict requirement of having a majority of members of parliament in order to govern properly, in order to have good governance, is a little bit exaggerated. A plurality, yes. But an absolute majority, I think that may be inconvenient. And finally, I think that there are several reforms. He mentioned some of the achievements of the last 15 years. Tomorrow I will be in a seminar. We have arranged 20 years after we published the report, Perú, Agenda y Estrategia para el Siglo XXI. That was a result of 8 years of work going all over the country and trying to build by consensus a direction for the future of the country. The report was published precisely when President Paniagua began his transition government in late 2000. What we are going is going and look back, what were the proposals that we made at that time? And we have seen, as President Duque very aptly has pointed out, that in the economic sphere, in infrastructure, and a few social services, there have been significant improvements over the last, especially the 15 years between 2000 and 2015-16. Unfortunately, on the institutional arrangements, which are crucial, the institutional reforms of the state, the institutional reforms in the private sector, which the private sector has to do itself, the changes in society, the process of decentralization, we have not progressed as much. And in some cases, we have gone backwards. By the way, the current Congress is putting back a reform of the education, higher education, that was crucial to improve the quality of education. Last week, they simply killed that reform primarily for really very petty concerns of a few businessmen who have private universities and do not want any control whatsoever and are not, they don't stop at slandering, telling lies and distorting facts in order to get what they want. So in short, what we have not been able to do is to bring the institutional reforms that will sustain over the medium and long term those very good performance measures, performance indicators that we had in the economic side. But also, in the last chapter of Agenda Peru in year 2000, we had a chapter called Cultura, Identidad y Valores. It was the first time that in an economic development strategy and social development strategy, we paid so much attention to the issue of values and culture. And our argument there was very simple, that Peru is a multicultural nation. Peru is, has a diversity of diversities, not only of natural resources, but of ethnic groups, of cultures, and so on. And unfortunately, And I would say, as most of Latin America, we have not learned how to integrate that in a positive manner to take advantage of that diversity, which is what confers us the resilience that is required over the next 20, 30, 40 years to deal with the challenges of climate change, of environmental disruption, of technological advances, of mass media, fake news, and so on and so forth. So I would argue that whatever happens in the short and medium term, and I just outlined some ways of getting out of the present predicament, whoever comes in the next government, even if it's another transition government, and more important, whoever comes in 2026 has a clear agenda that should focus on institutional reforms at all levels, not only in the state, and decentralization, how to improve and mobilize resources from the private sector, how to deal with what is called the informal economy. It's a term that I don't like because it really hides a lot of diversity. I prefer to talk about self-generated livelihoods, because this is what happened. Many people in the formal sector are those who create their own jobs and their own ways of sustaining themselves. So we need to focus on that as well. But at the same time, as I try to point out in some of my speeches, and dear President Duque, your ambassador, Maria Claudia, a good friend, was in Sacsayhuamán when on June 24th, 2021, I gave a speech calling precisely for a new conception and reconciliation of the different cultures that comprise Peru. And in that sense, Peru is much more diverse than other regions, other countries in the region, and that gives us a tremendous challenge and a tremendous opportunity. And what you pointed out, that we need to find a coalition of political parties that, in the first place, should acknowledge this. After acknowledging, then realizing what it implies, and then finally putting the conclusions of that analysis in practice through political, institutional, social, and economic reforms that would put Peru in a position to take advantage of the extraordinary possibilities that it has.
Thank you, President Sagasti. Really enlightening all your reflections. Thank you for that. Peru is a curious country. Its performance, economically speaking, has been extraordinary in the last 20 years, always leading the Latin American countries for many years. But today it seems that the economy is weakening a little bit, influenced by, of course, politics. And one of the problems that we can see is that the public sector is very, very not good executing their infrastructure expenditure, and the civil service of Peru is getting behind because many civil servants are afraid to execute the infrastructure because they are afraid of being accused of corruption. And this is one of the parts that explain why there are no infrastructure in many parts of the country, especially in the south of Peru. President Duque, you managed to execute almost 85% of your governmental plan, even in a pandemic time, which is amazing. Can you explain to us how can you get that, and what is the arrangements that you have in the public sector to execute infrastructure very quickly and very efficiently?
So, thank you. And again, I think President Sagasti's comments have been very enriching. And President Sagasti, I'm not suggesting that you have to build that majority per se in order to be a successful president. And by no means. What I was suggesting is that, in fact, when you don't have that capacity, according to the Peruvian constitution, that weakening of the presidential power, it's evident. Obviously, and I saw your case, you were able to bridge the political divide on specific matters, and there have been other of your predecessors who did it successfully, but others who were not capable of doing it, and that's a reality. And I think that puts a little bit more complexity to dealing with the whole situation. But looking at Juan Jose's question, I think when I look at Colombia and Peru, Colombia did something in the 80s, which was the popular election of governors and mayors, and that allowed decentralization to emerge as a way of strengthening the institutional architecture locally. And Peru has also done the same, with the slight differences. I think the amount of responsibilities of local governments in Colombia vis-a-vis Peru shows that there's a very big difference in the institutional instruments that mayors and governors have in the case of Peru. So they have the election, but the capacity of them to build a strong technocracy and the possibility of executing major size projects, it's more limited. And in my humble opinion, I think Peru is now at a maturity level of institutions that process should happen. Now, would that accelerate the works overnight? Maybe not. But it has to happen in order to build a better institutional architecture. And for example, I was pretty active, and you remember when in our days at the IDB, when the discussion about the royalty system in Peru was something very important to guarantee that the level of responsibilities will come with the level of resources for local governments. In some places it worked, but in other places it didn't. And I think that's also something that ought to be solved. But going explicitly of what Colombia has been able to achieve in terms of executing infrastructure projects, I would say there are three elements that have worked in Colombia very good. One is the public-private partnerships architecture. And we designed the first public-private partnership bills maybe 12 years ago. I remember at the beginning of the Santos administration, Minister Germán Cardona passed in Congress a good legislation that updated some of the risk distribution systems, and that allowed also for new projects to emerge. And we were able, in just 4 years, and even in the midst of a pandemic, to basically build more than 5,000 kilometers of roads in Colombia under the PPP system, but also under the public works execution, where we increase the amount of transparency and the follow-up on specific works. And that's why Cruce de la Cordillera Central happened, the most important project ever in Colombia's history. The tunnel of La Línea, the longest tunnel in Latin America and the Caribbean, was able to be finalized after decades of people thinking that it was just a white elephant, but it's now working. And I think that worked. Second thing is the capacity of bringing resources to the communities and allowing the local governments to execute with a strong level of supervision was crucial for the tertiary road systems in Colombia. But still, we have to challenge with corruption risks and institutional risks, but that allowed us to move very rapid. And I'll say the third element, which has also been, in my opinion, modernized, is how we can develop systems to execute works with the private sector. So we made a reform on the royalty system, and 20% out of the royalties can be executed by the companies who generate the royalties. And it's called royalties for works. So that allowed, for example, in places where we don't have the engineering capacity, the supervision capacity to say, for example, to the oil and gas companies, you know what, you do the works, so they build the school, they build the hospital, they build the road, and is part of the compensation of what they should return to the state in terms of royalties, and that also had a very important impact in Colombia. So I'll say those three examples are positive, and I will finish by saying something that connects also the previous questions to this one. If we see the size of the challenge that Peru has today, I would humbly recommend to President Dina that a national unity cabinet has to be built. With a national unity cabinet with all the actors feel represented, I think there has to be an agreement with the parties. Something similar to what Spain did at a certain moment with the Pacto de la Moncloa, where there's a consensus on infrastructure and social safety net, and then how the political transition is going to be managed. So whether there's going to be a call of new elections or Dina is going to finish Castillo's term. Because the thing is, Dina was elected. People might like her or not, but she was elected. And she was elected on the same ballot. And is the only constitutional architecture that Peru has today to guarantee that margin of stability, unless the constitution is changed or unless the stalemate is fixed by a legitimate call of new elections. And that requires also a strong level of consensus. In my opinion, calling for elections immediately at the circumstances the country faces, I don't think that guarantees stability. I think a general agreement, a general consensus, a national unity cabinet, and a specific consensus on social safety net expansion in the country will have a better say. And let me finalize with this. Peru has one of the best cases of fiscal deficit reductions in Latin America. And it has one of the lowest level of debt to GDP and one of the best positions in terms of fiscal deficit. But I think at this point, it doesn't make any damage if Peru is willing to have a little bit more of a fiscal deficit, not substantial, but a little bit more, and a little bit more debt to GDP levels, but build the most aggressive social expenditure program of infrastructure that closes the social divides in the regions with a great level of coordination with the local governments. I said that to Pedro Castillo when he visited Colombia. I went to his inauguration. He visited Colombia. We talked many times. And I always said this was a mechanism to build better institutional architecture in Peru. And I say this humbly. I don't pretend here neither to patronize nor to give a lecture nor pontify of what Peru shall do. But it's based on my own experience and the love that I have for Peru and its people that I think this can be an efficient mechanism to solve the situation the country faces today.
Thank you, President Duque. President Sagasti, your comments on this issue and your final words, your final reflections on this before passing the floor to the public to allow them to make some questions.
Well, thank you very much. These are very, very interesting questions. On the last recommendation of President Duque, I have nothing to say. I do not believe that it is appropriate for a former president in my condition to give unsolicited advice. And so therefore, I won't mention anything. The only thing is that a national cabinet requires some very special conditions, and to compare El Pacto de la Moncloa with the present situation in Peru, I think it's a little bit far-fetched. But anyway, I have nothing to add on that. The second issue is a very important one that you raised, Mr. Neira, Dr. Neira, which has to do with the economic performance. And then I will make some comments on the very good experience that Colombia has on that was related by President Duque. First, during the transitional emergency government, in the first 6 months of 2021, we broke a 15-year record in terms of public investment effectiveness and efficiency. How did we do that? By basically trusting the people, using the existing institutional arrangements in various ministries and so on. And we really increased public investment in a significant way, in ways that had not been done before, even when we were a transitional emergency government, and at the same time we were dealing with the pandemic and trying to cope with that and all the restrictions. At the same time, we had to organize elections. At the same time, we had to organize social support systems for those who had lost their employment and other things during the pandemic. In spite of all the things we had to do at the same time, we broke a 15-year-old record on public investment. And, there is no time to tell you in detail how we did it, but I know, and we know that it can be done. And in that sense, President Duque is right. There are many, many things, even with a public sector that has some difficulties and so on. By the way, as someone who has worked with the American Development Bank since 1964, just as a footnote, when I was a student at the university and we had co-government, I was a member of the supervisory board of the loan that the IDB gave to the National University of Engineering in order to build labs and so on. So I began to get a sense of what multilateral bank does from a very early age. And then as chief of strategic planning at the World Bank, I was able to work. And also I have executed as chairman of several executing units, loans from the IDB and other institutions. So one of the things that I can say quite clearly is that a way of really getting around some of the internal difficulties at the public sector level and public sector administration is to use judicially, in a sensible manner, the support of multilateral development banks. And we have done that in several ways, by building technical assistance, by getting information, and so on and so forth, by also having an international loan from the Inter-American Development Bank in this place, which, by the way, the loan agreement has in the Peruvian Constitution the status of a law. So when people wanted to really distort the uses, I could argue very clearly that the loan has the status of a national law and it cannot be modified. So there are ways in which institutions like the one you are in, like the Corporación Andina de Fomento, and President Duque knows how strongly Peru supported Colombia in that position, institutions like Inter-American Development Bank and the World Bank, all of them can help in a significant way to sort of remediate, in a sense, some of the difficulties and so on. But, and that works. And we can make it work, and we know how to make it work when it comes. But then comes the other problem, and decentralization that President Duque mentioned, and he's absolutely correct in the sense that Colombia has fared much better than Peru in terms of decentralized investment and so on. I had the fortune of spending a few years in Colombia many years ago to travel around the country to see what it is. And one of the things that really surprised me in comparison to Peru is how decentralized Colombia was in economic terms, in cultural terms, in social terms, how autonomous were the regions. And I was told repeatedly that this was a heritage from the 19th century, with very strong places in Antioquia, in the Caribbean, in Cartagena, in Bogota, and other places. So when decentralization processes came, Colombia had an excellent base on which to build the responsibility of local governments and local institutions to execute, not only to execute, but to do a variety of things, provide social services and so on and so forth. We have not been as fortunate as Colombia. As the center of the viceroyalty, Peru had Lima as the center of the whole of South America for many, many years, decades, and even centuries. So we built an extremely centralized. Added to that, the ethnic differences that we have between the highlands and the coast and the jungle area, this created a system in which the capacity for decision-making, for autonomous decision-making at the regional level at the beginning of the 21st century was much lower than that of Colombia. And I have learned a great deal from seeing what Colombia has done at the regional level and so on. So we had a major hurdle to really pass. By the way, the things that the three topics that President Duque has mentioned, public-private partnerships, resources to the community, and to develop a system to let the private sector use public resources, we have all of that in Peru. We have all of those provisions, and they have proved extremely useful in many cases. At the same time, those provisions were used by the private sector, and we have only to think of the Lava Jato scandal and many other scandals more recently by some foreign firms. I won't mention the country, but all of you know which countries now make a major push for investment in the region. We have seen corruption spread in a way that has undermined local and national capacities. So therefore, it's not a question of law, it's a question of practices, of people, and of leadership, as President Duque has pointed out. And finally, let me end, because we have a very, very little time, that to indicate that Peru has had over the course of its history many, many difficult times, many crisis periods. And we have been able to surmount them and really to come ahead again. A humorist, an architect, Héctor Velarde in Peru, coined the term concho telúrico de acometividad, which means a kind of a push, something that remains within you in which you can turn in order to really push ahead. I would argue we also have a concho telúrico de regeneratividad, a capacity to regenerate, and we have done it over and over again. So I am confident, knowing the capacity, the commitment of many young people, that after we pass this very critical incident of polarization, of questioning of the political system in Peru, we will have the opportunity to improve the standards of living for all, and also of learning from the lessons that we learned. We learned the lesson of hyperinflation, and President Duque is right. We are very cautious with an extremely independent central bank, with an excellent team at the Ministry of Economics and Finance. We know how to manage our macroeconomy well. We have a low ratio of debt, as he pointed out in there. Those lessons that we have learned from the 1880s, the lessons we learned about the insurgency of Shining Path and so on, now we can also learn the lessons of the instability of the last 5 years in order to chart a better future for the country in the years to come in the 21st century. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity for explaining.
Thank you. I wish we had more time to continue this interesting discussion, but I was ordered to finish it up. I just want to express my gratitude to these excellent former presidents, President Duque and President Sagasti, for this very interesting discussion. You made me feel more confident about the future of Peru after just hearing you, and I wish it's the same for the audience. I don't know if we have some time for some questions of the audience. No, okay. But so we have to finish up here. Thank you very much to both former presidents.
Thank you. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Just one note, my good friend, President Sagasti, I invited you to Colombia many times, and you had to wait some time after the presidency, but I look forward for you to come and visit again. You know how much we appreciate and we value not only your expertise, but also how much you love our country. So all the best to you and to the Peruvian people.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I will try to